The administrator's voice didn't waver once. That was what Audrey Whitlock would remember later. Not the words themselves, but how easily they came out. How clean. How practiced. Richard Harmon, Assistant Director of Patient Services at Mercy General Hospital, sat behind his glass desk with both hands folded like he was explaining a parking policy, and told her that her services were no longer required. 9 years, 3 commendations. 1 patient alive who would have been a body bag before she ever touched him. And Harmon delivered it all in 11 minutes flat, including the part where he slid the termination paperwork across the desk without meeting her eyes. "You performed a medical procedure outside your scope of licensure," he said, "that exposes this institution to significant liability." Audrey stared at the paper. He was dying. Dr. Fenwick had the situation under control. Dr. Fenwick was frozen. I watched him freeze. The patient's trachea had shifted and his oxygen sat was dropping through the floor. "Nurse Whitlock." Harmon finally looked up. Not with anger. Worse, with patience. The kind of patience reserved for people who have already made up their minds and just need the other person to stop talking. "The decision has been made. If you were standing in that room today, if that was your career, your rent, your entire adult life sitting in a folder being handed back to you, what would you do?" Because Audrey Whitlock did the only thing she knew how to do. She picked up her stethoscope off his desk, dropped it into her bag, and walked out. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we put out stories like this every single week. Stories about ordinary people dropped into impossible situations and what happens when they refuse to break. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, like this video if Audrey already has your full attention, because she's about to need it. The rain started somewhere between the elevator and the lobby. Audrey noticed it through the glass doors before she pushed through them. A full Philadelphia downpour, the kind that doesn't build gradually, but arrives all at once, like the sky made a decision. She stood for exactly 4 seconds under the overhang, looking at the parking structure across the street where her Civic had been sitting for 3 days with a blown alternator she hadn't had the money or the energy to deal with. Then she pulled the collar of her scrub top up against the back of her neck, adjusted the plastic bag containing her locker contents, her spare stethoscope, 2 granola bars, a photograph of her mother, and a coffee mug that said, "Nurses do it with care," that she'd always hated but kept anyway, and walked into the rain. She had 6 blocks to the nearest bus stop. She covered 2 of them before she started crying. Not the kind of crying she would have described out loud. It wasn't heaving or dramatic, it was just water. Her face was already soaked, so the tears just added themselves to everything else without ceremony. She cried because she was 32 years old and her career was in a plastic bag. She cried because she'd done the right thing and it had cost her everything. She cried because somewhere in a recovery room she would never be allowed to enter again. A man named Dale Kruger was breathing with both lungs because of what her hands had done that afternoon, and not one person in that building would ever acknowledge it. She cried for about half a block. Then she stopped because she was getting cold, and the bus wasn't going to wait, and self-pity was a luxury she couldn't afford tonight. She had rent due in 19 days. She had roughly $400 in checking and a savings account that had taken 3 separate hits since her car broke down. She had no references she trusted, not after today, and a termination on her record that she'd have to explain in every job interview for the rest of her working life. The plastic bag tore at the handle. She caught it with both hands before everything spilled onto the sidewalk, and stood there in the middle of the rain holding her own coffee mug against her chest and breathing through her nose. That's when she heard the engines. Not one engine. Multiple. Deep-throated and expensive, the kind of sound that belonged to vehicles that were maintained by professionals and never sat in a parking structure with a blown alternator. She heard them before she saw the headlights, and the headlights appeared from 2 directions simultaneously. 3 vehicles from the north end of the block, 2 more cutting the intersection from the east, all of them matte black, all of them moving too fast for the conditions and then stopping too precisely for coincidence. 5 SUVs, arranged around her in a shape that wasn't accidental. Audrey stopped walking. She was standing beside an abandoned warehouse. The windows had been boarded for years. The nearest streetlight was half a block back. It was 9:47 on a Thursday night, and the rain was heavy enough that she couldn't see past the perimeter the vehicles had formed. She could see the men stepping out of them, though 4, then 6, then more, all of them in dark clothes and tailored jackets that cost more than her monthly rent. None of them were police. None of them were EMTs. They moved like people who spent a significant portion of their lives practicing how to move. They formed a line between her and the street. Then the rear door of the center vehicle opened, and Callan Harrow stepped out. Audrey didn't know his name yet. She would learn it later. What she knew in that moment was that he was tall, over 6 feet, with dark hair that the rain was already flattening against his forehead, and a white dress shirt that would have been immaculate 20 minutes ago. The left sleeve was rolled up, the right sleeve and cuff were soaked through with something too dark to be water. He walked toward her with the measured, deliberate movement of a man who was accustomed to rooms going quiet when he entered them. He was controlling something. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the deliberate steadiness of his breathing. Whatever was happening inside him was being compressed into a very small, very tight space, and he was maintaining that compression with what appeared to be enormous effort. He stopped 4 feet in front of her. "Mercy General Trauma Nurse." He said it like a statement, not a question, looking somewhere past her right ear. "The one who's been working the evening shift, where is she?" Audrey's brain was doing 3 things at once. The rational part was noting that she was alone on a dark block surrounded by armed men, and this was the most dangerous situation she had ever been in. The professional part was noting that the bloodstain on his shirt was arterial. The pattern was too wide and too fresh for a wound on Callan himself, which meant it had come from someone else, someone who was close enough to bleed on him. And a third part, quieter and more animal, was noting the smear of blood on the rear window of the vehicle behind him, the way it had dragged downward, the specific geometry of a hand losing its grip. "I'm the nurse," Audrey said. Callan's eyes finally landed on her. He looked at her scrubs, the torn plastic bag, the coffee mug she was still holding. He looked at her face, 32, rain-soaked, eyes that were swollen at the edges from crying she wasn't going to acknowledge. Whatever image he'd constructed in his head of the trauma nurse from Mercy General, it wasn't this. "You're her." "I was." She adjusted her grip on the bag. "I got fired tonight." "Which is irrelevant to whatever this is, but I'm guessing you don't care about context." He stared at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't categorize. It was somewhere between calculation and something much rawer than that. Something that looked briefly like fear wearing a mask. Then he stepped aside. "Come with me." Audrey looked at the line of men between her and the street. She looked at the vehicle. She looked back at Callan Harrow, the blood on his cuff, and the smeared handprint on the glass. She pulled the battered stethoscope from her coat pocket. "Show me who's hurt first." He didn't argue. He moved to the rear door and pulled it open. Everett Harrow was 24 years old, and he had the kind of face that made people want to look out for him. Open and younger than his years, the sort of face that hadn't finished becoming whatever it was going to be. Right now that face was the color of old dishwater, and his lips had gone gray at the edges, and he was conscious enough to be scared, but not conscious enough to hide it. The gunshot had caught him in the upper thigh. Someone had applied a tourniquet. She could see it immediately, blue nylon strap, tightened but positioned wrong. Not wrong in a small way. Wrong in the way that made the hemorrhage worse instead of better, compressing the superficial tissue while the femoral beneath continued to pump. Audrey's bag hit the pavement. She was inside the vehicle before any of the men surrounding her could process the movement, her stethoscope finding Everett's radial pulse with one hand, while the other found the wound beneath his soaked trousers. Pulse was there. Weak and fast, the particular quality of a cardiovascular system working too hard to compensate for what it was losing. "How long ago?" She didn't phrase it as a question. 40 minutes. Callan's voice came from directly behind her. 45. She found the tourniquet placement with her fingers and felt her jaw tighten. Who put this on him? "My man. He was trying. I know what he was trying to do. It's wrong. I need to reposition it, and I need gauze, and I need someone who isn't going to get in my way." She looked over her shoulder directly at Callan. "Are you going to get in my way?" His expression shifted into something she would later describe as the moment she realized he was a man who almost never deferred to anyone, confronting the fact that he had no alternative. "No." "Then get in here and hold him still." The next 8 minutes were the most controlled chaos of Audrey's professional life. The SUV was moving before she finished repositioning the tourniquet. Callan gave some signal she didn't see, and the convoy was suddenly in motion, tearing through rain-soaked streets at a speed that would have frightened her if she'd had attention to spare for fear. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze from a field kit she found zip-tied to the back of the front seat, applied compression with both hands, and then held it while she directed Callan to maintain counterpressure. He did exactly what she told him. No pushback, no ego, no explanation that he was not the kind of man who took orders. He just did it. Everett looked up at the ceiling and made a sound somewhere between a question and a prayer. "Hey!" Audrey moved her face into his line of vision. "What's your name?" "Everett." It came out rough, tongue thick with blood pressure dropping. "I'm Audrey. I'm going to keep you with us, okay? I need you to stay awake. Tell me something. What did you eat for dinner tonight?" A pause. His eyes focused slightly. "Didn't." "Smart. Less to clean up later." Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't not one either. Callan's eyes found her over Everett's body. She didn't look back at him. She was watching the tourniquet, watching the gauze, monitoring the pulse at Everett's wrist with 2 fingers, while the vehicle took a hard turn and her shoulder caught the door. "Where are we going?" she said. "Secure facility." Callan's voice had changed. It had been compressed before. Now it was stripped down to something purely functional, the way people talk when they've moved past emotion into pure logistics. "Medical equipment. Dr. Pike was supposed to be there." "Supposed to be." "He's not answering." Audrey processed this. She pressed harder on the wound. Everett hissed. "What does this facility have in terms of surgical capacity?" "Everything Pike needed." "What was Pike going to do?" "Vascular repair, the artery." She kept her face neutral. Her hand stayed steady. In her head, she was running a clinical calculation. She didn't like the numbers on femoral artery involvement, volume loss over 40-plus minutes, a tourniquet that had been doing the wrong job for most of that time. Now, 40 additional minutes of improvised compression in the back of a moving vehicle. Everett's window was not large. If the physician who was supposed to be waiting didn't materialize, and if the damage to the artery was what she suspected, then what was waiting at this facility was a room full of equipment she was not trained to use and a procedure she was not credentialed to perform. And yet, she looked at Everett's face, still gray, still scared, still conscious. "He's going to make it to the facility," she said. To Callan, to Everett, to herself, because that was the only calculation that mattered right now. The convoy stopped. They were beneath something, a building, she realized when they pulled her out, and she saw the industrial ceiling above her, old concrete and steel beams, the kind of structure that had been built for one purpose and converted to another without erasing what it originally was. Men were moving around them, pulling doors open, guiding them through. Someone handed her a fresh pair of gloves. She didn't ask how they knew what size. Then they were inside the medical suite. Audrey had expected something improvised, a table, a lamp, some basic supplies. What she found stopped her for a full 3 seconds at the doorway, not because she'd never seen equipment like this, but because she hadn't expected to find it here, under a building that looked like a decommissioned factory, in a facility that technically didn't exist. Surgical table, full anesthesia station, 2 ventilators, a crash cart with a defibrillator that looked like it had never been used, supply cabinets organized with a precision that suggested someone with clinical training had stocked them, an overhead surgical lamp array. She moved toward the supply cabinets. "Your surgeon, where is he?" She was already pulling drawers. "We don't know." Callan's voice came from behind her, controlled but with an edge she could hear pressing through the surface. "He was here 2 hours ago." "Do you have anyone else with medical training?" Silence. She found the sterile tubing kits, found the vascular clamps, found the surgical-grade suction equipment. Her hands moved through the drawers with professional efficiency while her mind worked the problem from both directions. She was a trauma nurse. She'd spent 9 years in one of the busiest trauma bays in Philadelphia. She'd observed vascular surgical procedures from inside the OR during cross-training rotations. She knew what a temporary arterial shunt looked like. She knew, approximately, how one functioned. She had never placed one. She turned around. Callan was watching her from the doorway with an expression that had resolved itself into something specific now. Not fear exactly, but an awareness. The awareness of a man who understood exactly how much he didn't control about what was about to happen. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I need your surgeon." She held his gaze. "Since I don't have him, I need you to understand what I'm about to explain to you, and I need you to follow every instruction I give you without question. You're going to repair it. I'm going to bridge it, temporary shunt. We restore flow to the leg, we keep the artery viable, and we buy him hours until you can get me someone who can actually reconstruct it." She paused. "If I do nothing, we both know what happens." Callan's throat moved. The muscle in his jaw pressed and released. "What do you need from me?" "Scrub in." If he'd hesitated, she would have lost respect for him. He didn't. He crossed to the sink, found the surgical scrub brush, and started the protocol she talked him through step by step. 2 minutes, between the fingers, up to the elbows. He had large hands, and they worked the brush without wasted motion. She noticed, because hands mattered in a surgical context, and his were steady. They were steady in a way that suggested he had done things that required steadiness before, just not this particular thing. Everett was on the table now, positioned by the men who'd carried him from the vehicle. His vital signs were poor, but not terminal. She had a window, and she was going to use it. She gowned up, gloved, stood across from Callan. "You're going to hold the retractors, and you're going to do exactly what I tell you," she said. "When I say hold, you hold. When I say release, you release gradually. You do not improvise." "Understood." "If anything surprises you, if anything looks wrong or you're not sure, you tell me. You don't guess." "Understood." She looked at Everett's face one more time. He'd slipped into the early edges of unconsciousness. Not all the way under, but close enough that his face had gone slack, the fear draining out of it into something that looked almost like sleep. She picked up the scalpel. The next 45 minutes were the longest and most precise of Audrey Whitlock's life. She worked through the damaged tissue with the methodical, careful focus of someone who had spent 9 years training for emergencies and understood that panic was just wasted energy. She located the femoral artery, damaged. Yes, the bullet had clipped rather than severed, but the hemorrhage site was significant, and the arterial wall integrity was compromised on a 2-centimeter section. She placed her clamps. She talked Callan through each retractor position in a low, even voice, the same voice she'd used on patients for years. The voice that meant I am in control of this situation, even when she wasn't entirely sure she was. He did not improvise. He held when she said hold, released when she said release, adjusted millimeters in the direction she indicated without asking why. He was a fast study, and he was unafraid of blood, which mattered more than she would have expected. Some people who were entirely comfortable with violence and its outcomes still flinched at clinical proximity to the body. Callan did not flinch. She fitted the shunt, sterile, flexible tubing from the supply cabinet, sized as close as she could calculate, connected with clamps at both ends of the damaged section. It was not elegant. No surgeon would have called it beautiful. It was the medical equivalent of a bridge thrown across a gap in a storm, built from what was available, built to hold for a specific amount of time. She released the proximal clamp slowly. Blood entered the tubing. She watched it move through the transparent wall of the tube, dark at first, then brightening as oxygenated flow resumed. She watched the distal end. She watched the tube seat correctly against the arterial wall without displacement. Then she looked at Everett's foot. For a long moment, nothing. Then the color began to change, the gray pallor that had settled into his extremity over the past hour. That particular terrible shade that every trauma nurse knew started to shift. Not quickly. Gradually. The pink returning like something that had been withheld and was now being let back in. Everett's pulse strengthened under her fingers. She exhaled. She had not realized she was holding her breath. Callan was watching her. She felt it without looking up. "He's stable," she said. "For now. The shunt will hold for 4 to 6 hours if nothing disturbs it. I need a vascular surgeon here before that window closes." A pause. Then Callan's voice, quieter than it had been all night. "I'll find one. You have 4 hours. I heard you the first time." She looked up at him then. He was still standing across the table, retractors in gloved hands, the overhead surgical light catching the angles of his face. There was blood on his gown. Everett's blood, the same blood that had been on his cuff when she first saw him, and an expression she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated than that, and more uncomfortable. The look of a man confronting the specific dimensions of what he had just watched someone do for someone he loved. "Thank you," he said, simply, without architecture around it. Audrey peeled off her outer gloves and dropped them in the waste bin. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when his surgeon gets here." She pulled up a stool beside the surgical table. She was not leaving Everett Harrow's side. Not until the man on the table had someone qualified enough to finish what she'd started, and not a minute before. Outside, somewhere above them, Philadelphia was still raining. The stool Audrey pulled up beside the surgical table was metal, and it was cold through the thin fabric of her scrub pants, and she did not move from it for the next 2 hours. She sat with 2 fingers resting against Everett's wrist, not because she couldn't see the improvised monitoring setup she'd assembled from the equipment in the suite, but because she needed the direct contact. The pulse was her information. It told her things the numbers on the screen couldn't, the specific texture of a cardiovascular system working to stabilize, the slight irregularities that could mean nothing or could mean everything depending on which direction they went. She had learned this early in her career and never stopped believing it. Machines gave you data. Your fingers told you the truth. Everett's truth, at the moment, was fragile but holding. His color had improved fractionally. The terrible grayness had retreated from his extremities toward something closer to human, and when she checked the shunt at 30-minute intervals, the flow through the transparent tubing remained consistent, dark and steady, doing the job she'd built it to do. The clamps were seated correctly. The arterial wall was holding against the connection points. Everything she had put together in that room was functioning exactly as she'd needed it to. She knew it could change in minutes. That was the nature of temporary. Callan was outside. She could hear him through the walls, or rather, she could hear the controlled absence of his voice, the kind of silence that filled a space when someone was containing a conversation rather than having one. Occasional words reached her, names she didn't recognize, locations, a tune that never elevated into shouting but carried the specific gravity of a man issuing instructions that would be followed without question. One of his men, younger than the rest, with a square jaw and the careful, slightly over-attentive manner of someone trying to prove his worth, had been stationed inside the door. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him and watched Audrey work with an expression that moved between professional neutrality and something closer to awe that he was trying hard not to show. 20 minutes in, he'd offered her water. She'd taken it without looking up, drunk half the bottle, handed it back. An hour in, she said, "What's your name?" "Dorian." "Dorian, I need you to go tell whoever is in charge out there that I need fresh gloves, size 7, and something to eat. Doesn't matter what. Crackers. Anything." He'd gone and returned in 4 minutes with gloves and a package of peanut butter crackers that had clearly come from someone's jacket pocket and were slightly crushed at one corner. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, returned to his position at the door, and resumed not looking at her in a way that meant he was absolutely looking at her. She ate the crackers one-handed, checking Everett's pulse with the other, and did not think about the fact that she had been awake since 5:30 that morning. The door opened. Callan came through it without announcing himself. Not rudely, just the way people moved who had never developed the habit of asking permission to enter rooms. He'd rolled up both sleeves now and had removed the blood-stained portion of his cuff entirely, leaving his right forearm bare. He'd also washed his hands. She could see the clean line of it, the dark staining gone from his skin, though not entirely from the edges of his wrist. He stood at the foot of the surgical table and looked at Everett with an expression he didn't bother composing into anything more controlled than what it actually was. For a moment he forgot she was watching him. That was how she got the clearest look at it. The way his face went when the professional architecture came down, just for a few seconds. The thing underneath wasn't grief exactly, but it was adjacent to it. It was the expression of someone who had spent years making themselves into something impervious and was finding the limits of that construction. Then he looked at her, and the architecture came back up. "I have a surgeon coming," he said. "Dr. Lynn Tran, she's a vascular specialist. She worked at Penn before she—" He stopped. "She can do the repair." "How long?" 2 hours? Maybe a little more. She's driving from Baltimore. Audrey processed the timeline against Everett's current status. The shunt should hold. Tell her I used a 10 mm internal diameter flexible tube, proximal clamp placed at the superior femoral junction, distal at the mid-thigh level. She'll want to know the exact placement before she opens him. Callan repeated it back to her, word for word, with the precision of someone who had trained himself to retain information accurately under pressure. She looked at him. "You have a good memory," she said. "Necessary in my line of work." "What exactly is your line of work?" The pause was brief. "Various things. The men outside are carrying weapons under their jackets. You have a private surgical facility under a warehouse, and someone shot your brother tonight. So I'm going to assume it's not import-export." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not offense, more like recalibration. The adjustment of someone who had encountered, unexpectedly, a person who said the obvious thing directly instead of maneuvering around it. "Would it change anything if you knew exactly what it was?" "No." She looked back at Everett. "I'm not asking because I'm reconsidering. I'm asking because I've spent the last 2 hours keeping your brother alive, and I'd like to know the general shape of the situation I'm in." Callan was quiet for a moment. He moved to stand beside the table on the opposite side from her, looking down at his brother's face with the focus of someone cataloging changes. He reached out and adjusted the edge of the surgical drape, a small, careful gesture, more personal than clinical. "Someone in my organization tried to have Everett killed tonight," he said. "The route he was traveling was not public information. The location of this facility was known to fewer than 8 people." He paused. "Now it appears whoever compromised Everett's route also compromised Dr. Pike." Compromised. "He disappeared from this facility approximately 90 minutes before we arrived. His phone is off. His car is gone." He paused again. "He was well paid and well protected. The only reason someone would move him is to ensure the clinic would be unstaffed when we arrived." Audrey let that sit. "So whoever wanted Everett dead wanted him to bleed out here," she said. "They removed the surgeon as a second layer." "Yes." "And they didn't know I existed." "No one knew you existed." He said it without irony. "I asked one of my men to locate the trauma nurse from Mercy General's evening shift. He didn't know your shift had ended early. The information was 30 minutes old." She looked up at him. "Your man stopped me on the street because his information was out of date." "Yes." "And the person trying to kill your brother didn't account for the possibility that someone capable of keeping him alive might be in the wrong place at the right time." "That appears to be the case." Audrey turned that over slowly. She was exhausted, the kind of exhausted that had moved past the sensation of tiredness into a sort of flat, clear-edged alertness that her body produced when she pushed past the wall. She'd run on this fuel before, during long double shifts and catastrophic trauma nights. It was not comfortable, but it was functional. "I want to know something," she said. Callan waited. "The man who shot Everett, is he someone you can identify?" Something moved across Callan's face. "We have him." "Is he going to tell you who sent him?" "He already has." She looked at his face. His expression was completely still, the way a surface goes still when something heavy has settled beneath it. "You know who it is?" "I have a strong indication." "And what are you going to do about it?" The silence that followed was specific in texture. It wasn't the silence of a man deciding how to answer. It was the silence of a man who already knew his answer and was deciding how much of it to give her. "What I have to do," he said. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now." She studied his face for another moment. Then she looked back at Everett. "If you're wrong about who it is," she said quietly, "and you act before you're certain, it won't just be your problem." Callan looked at her. "It will be your brother's problem too. Because whatever you do next, Everett is going to live with the fallout." The muscle in Callan's jaw moved. He didn't answer, but he also didn't dismiss it, and she noticed that too. The door opened. The man who entered was somewhere in his mid-50s, with the build of someone who had once been larger and had reduced over time, and a face that had the specific weathered quality of decades spent in difficult rooms. He wore a charcoal jacket that fit well and moved with the ease of someone who had been in Callan's orbit long enough that proximity to power had become unremarkable. Callan said, "Mitchell." The man, Mitchell, nodded once at Callan and then let his eyes move briefly, assessingly, to Audrey. The look lasted perhaps 2 seconds and communicated a thorough evaluation she found immediately uncomfortable. Not threatening exactly, more like being measured for something she hadn't agreed to be measured for. "Status on the southern corridor," Mitchell said. "Secure." Callan's voice had shifted almost imperceptibly. A very slight increase in formal distance, the way people talked when they were maintaining a performance of normalcy over something else. What did Reeves find? Nothing useful. Whoever accessed the schedule did it through an authenticated channel. Clean entry, clean exit. Whoever it was knew the system. Which means it wasn't external. Mitchell's eyes moved to Everett and stayed there for a moment. "Appears not." Audrey was watching Mitchell's face as he looked at Everett Harrow, lying on the surgical table with makeshift tubing keeping his leg alive. She was watching it the way she'd learned to watch faces in the trauma bay, not looking for what people were showing, but for the half-second before they decided what to show. What she saw on Mitchell Graves's face in the half-second before he composed it into appropriate concern was not grief. She couldn't have said what it was exactly. It was brief, and she was tired, and she might have been wrong. But it was the absence of something that should have been there, and the presence of something else. And it passed across his features like a draft through a room before the door closed again. She looked back at Everett. She didn't say anything. She filed it. Callan and Mitchell talked for several more minutes in the low, compact shorthand of men who had worked together a long time. She listened without appearing to, monitoring Everett's vitals and turning what she was hearing into information. Names she didn't know. A location referred to as the Ferris property. A discussion of timing that she couldn't fully parse. Mitchell was controlled and precise and deferential in a way that was practiced rather than natural. She noticed it the way she noticed things that didn't quite fit the anatomical model. When you knew what normal looked like, abnormal had a specific texture. Mitchell left. The room felt slightly different without him in it, and Audrey wasn't sure if she was imagining that. Callan remained at the foot of the table. He looked older than he had an hour ago, which was something she'd seen happen to people in emergency situations when the adrenaline metabolized and the actual weight of the night settled in. He was still controlled, still functional, but the seams were visible now, where they hadn't been before. "How long have you been in this line of work?" she asked. Not prodding, just filling the silence with something that wasn't the beeping of equipment and the sound of Everett's labored breathing. Colin's eyes moved to her face. "Long enough." "You grew up in it." A pause. "My father built the organization. I inherited it at 26 when he died." His voice was flat on the facts, the flatness of something that had been stated so many times that the emotional content had been worn smooth. Everett was 17. He didn't have a choice either. He had more than I did. I made sure of it. Something shifted in his voice. Not much, just enough. He was never supposed to be in positions like... He stopped. Like tonight. Like tonight. Audrey checked the shunt again. Stable. She adjusted Everett's pulse ox clip by 2 millimeters and watched the number climb 1 digit before steadying. "He called you," she said, "after he was shot." Callan didn't answer immediately. "He called me first," he said finally. "He didn't call dispatch. He didn't call anyone else. He called me." He looked at his brother's face. By the time I got to him, he'd already tried to tie off the wound himself with his own belt. He was sitting on the pavement in the rain trying to stay conscious. Audrey let that sit in the room. "He trusts you," she said. "He's the only person who should." He paused. "Given what I've apparently allowed to happen." The self-condemnation in it was quiet, and therefore more honest than if he'd said it louder. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. She didn't know yet whether it was or wasn't, and she wasn't in the business of offering comfort she couldn't verify. "The surgeon will be here in time," she said instead. "Focus on that." He nodded once, moved toward the door, stopped. "Why didn't you run?" he said. Not accusing, genuinely asking. "When my men surrounded you." A reasonable person would have. "I saw the blood on your window," she said. "I saw the hand sliding down the glass." She paused. "There's no version of that where I walk away." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked out. The next 40 minutes were quieter. Dorian maintained his post. Audrey maintained hers. She ran her checks at precise intervals and documented them in her head because there was nothing to document them on. Building a clinical picture of Everett Harrow that she could hand off to Dr. Tran the moment she arrived. She was mid-assessment when Everett opened his eyes. Not fully. Halfway. The particular half-consciousness of heavy blood loss and the body pulling resources away from non-essential functions. His eyes found the ceiling first, then moved. "Hey," Audrey said. Same voice she'd used in the SUV, quiet and specific, the voice that said, "I know exactly where you are." "You're in a medical facility. You're stable. Your brother is nearby." Everett's lips moved. She leaned closer. "Did I lose the leg?" His voice was barely there, rough and dry. "No," she said. "The leg is intact. I built a temporary repair, and we have a surgeon coming to make it permanent." A long exhale. Something complicated moved through his features. "You're the nurse." "I'm the nurse." Callan said. He stopped, swallowed, tried again. "He said you were fired." "I was." "For helping someone." "Something like that." Everett's eyes moved to the ceiling again. His pulse ticked along under her fingers, still fragile, still holding. "That's a terrible thing," he said quietly, "to punish someone for helping. It happens." "Does it make you angry?" "Furiously." She said it without heat because real anger didn't need heat to be recognized. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Me too," he said, and she wasn't entirely sure he was still talking about her. He drifted again, back down into the shallow unconsciousness his body was using as a recovery tool. She monitored his return and sat back on her stool and let herself breathe. And that was when the man at the door, Dorian, turned his head sharply toward the wall. He moved his hand to his earpiece and pressed it, and the quality of his attention shifted from watchful to rigid in the space of a single second. "What?" Audrey said. Dorian turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, his carefully composed expression had cracked along a specific fault line. "There are vehicles outside," he said. "On the perimeter. They don't have IDs." Audrey stood up. "How many?" "They're still counting." His hand was already moving inside his jacket. "Ma'am, I need you to move away from the windows. There aren't any windows in here." "Away from the door." She didn't move away from the door. She moved between the door and Everett's table because that was the only positioning that made any sense to her. Whatever was outside was outside. What mattered was what was in this room. Callan came through the door 30 seconds later, and the architecture was completely gone from his face now. Just the raw infrastructure underneath, all angles and controlled velocity, the face of a man who had received information and was already 3 steps into responding to it. "Audrey." He didn't soften it with preamble. "The perimeter is compromised. We have 8 vehicles approaching from the north and east. My men are taking positions, but we're under strength here. I pulled resources to secure the transport corridor." "Someone told them where this facility is," she said. "Yes." "The same someone who moved your surgeon?" "Yes." "So they knew we were going to make it here. They planned for the surgeon to be gone and then followed us anyway." "It appears so." She looked at Everett. The monitors, the shunt, the IV line she'd run 30 minutes ago to push fluids. The specific, impossible fragility of a temporary repair that could not survive disruption. "If there's a firefight in this building," she started. "I know." His voice was hard. "We are not letting them into this room." "You can promise that." It wasn't a question. He heard it as what it was. "No," he said. "I cannot promise that." He reached inside his jacket. He held out the handgun with the grip facing her, his eyes on her face, watching her read what he was doing before he explained it. Audrey looked at the weapon. She had held one twice in her life. Once at a range with a friend who'd insisted it would help her feel safer, and once when she'd found her ex-boyfriend's unregistered pistol in a shoebox in their shared closet and hadn't been able to stop shaking until she'd put it in a paper bag and driven it to a police evidence drop-off. "I'm a nurse," she said. "I know what you are." "I save lives. I know." He held it steady. "They are not going to leave witnesses, Audrey. Anyone in this building, when they're done, is not going to matter to them." She heard something in the walls of the building then. Distant, structural, the kind of sound that wasn't quite sound but was more like the building registering something happening against it. She looked at Everett. She looked at the shunt, the monitors, the man on the table whose foot had turned pink under her hands. She took the gun. It was heavier than she remembered. Her grip on it was not confident, and she did not pretend otherwise. Callan looked at her hands. He didn't correct her grip. He seemed to understand that the instruction session was not a luxury they had time for. "Stay in this room," he said. Keep the door covered. If something comes through that isn't me or one of my men and it's heading toward him." He stopped. "I know," she said. He held her eyes for one more second. Then he turned and moved into the corridor and the door closed. Audrey stood between the closed door and Everett Harrow's surgical table. The gun in her right hand, 2 fingers of her left on his wrist, his pulse moving under her fingertips, thin and steady, like a thread stretched across a very long distance. She had made herself a single promise in the last hour, in the specific part of her mind that didn't negotiate with circumstances or make exceptions for impossible situations. Whatever happened in this building tonight, Everett Harrow was going to be alive when Dr. Lin Tran walked through that door. The first explosion shook the wall hard enough that the overhead surgical lamp swung 2 inches on its mount, and Everett's eyes flew open, and Audrey did not flinch. The second explosion was louder than the first. Audrey felt it in her sternum before she heard it, a deep concussive thud that traveled through the concrete floor and up through the legs of the stool. She was no longer sitting on, because she was standing, both feet planted, back pressed against the cabinet behind her with the gun in her right hand, and her left still on Everett's wrist. His pulse spiked. Of course it did. His body was responding to sound and vibration the way bodies did when they'd been trained by adrenaline. Even half unconscious, even this depleted, the autonomic nervous system was still running its programs. His blood pressure was going to climb, and that was the last thing the shunt needed. "Everett." She moved to his head, put her hand flat against his sternum. "Everett, stay with me. Look at me." His eyes found her face. Unfocused, scared in the specific way of someone who cannot fully process what they're scared of. "You're not moving," she said. "You understand me? Whatever happens, you do not move that leg. The tube in your thigh is keeping you alive, and if it displaces, what's happening?" His voice was barely there. "Your brother is handling it." She said it with a certainty she had no right to, and held his gaze until she felt his body make the decision to believe her. Dorian had moved from the door to a position to the left of it, his weapon out now, his earlier careful composure stripped down to pure function. He was communicating through his earpiece in fragments, numbers, positions, directional coordinates that meant nothing to Audrey, but clearly meant specific things to whoever was on the other end. She heard gunfire. Not cinematic gunfire. The real kind. Sharp, percussive, intimate in a way that made the building feel smaller than it was. It was coming from the north corridor, which was the direction Callan had gone. Dorian's hand went to his earpiece again. His jaw tightened. "What?" Audrey said. "East entrance is breached." He moved toward the door, stopped, looked at her, and made a visible calculation between his instruction to stay in this room and his training that told him the east corridor was 30 feet away and getting louder. "I need to—" "You were told to stay here, Miss Whitlock. You were told to stay here." She said it with the same voice she used on residents who were about to make decisions driven by urgency instead of assessment. Flat. Absolute. Requiring compliance rather than requesting it. He stayed. 3 minutes passed. The gunfire from the north corridor came in bursts, not sustained, which she processed as controlled engagement rather than panic fire, which she decided meant Callan's men were holding their positions. The east corridor stayed loud. Something struck the wall of the room. She couldn't tell if it was a body or a piece of structural debris, and she chose not to think about it. Then the door opened. She raised the gun. It was one of Callan's men. She recognized him by the dark jacket and the fact that he was bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow rather than from a gunshot wound, which her brain registered as distinguishing information before she fully lowered the weapon. He moved through the door fast, pulled it closed behind him, and reported to Dorian in clipped sentences about the east entrance and a secondary team moving through the building's utility corridor. Dorian made a decision. "I need to move you," he told Audrey. "I'm not moving him." She put herself closer to the table. "The shunt cannot be moved, Dorian. If that tube shifts even a centimeter at the wrong point—" "Not him!" He moved toward her, not threatening, urgent. "We need to move you, separate you from the room." She stared at him. "That's insane." "The intelligence on this team is that they're here to finish a job and eliminate anyone who can talk about what happened tonight. If you're in the same room as Everett, then I'm in the same room as Everett." She turned back to the table. "That's the end of that conversation." Dorian looked at the other man. Something passed between them. They didn't press it further. She heard Callan's voice in the corridor before he came through the door. Not the words, just the register of it. That specific controlled authority that apparently didn't change whether he was in a boardroom or a gunfight. He came through the door with blood on his left forearm, fresh, and a split across his lower lip that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. He looked at Everett first, then at Audrey, then at the gun in her hand. "You're all right," he said. "So far." She looked at his arm. "You're bleeding." "It's not significant. Show me." He crossed to the cabinet and she wrapped the cut with gauze in 40 seconds. Tight enough to matter, not so tight as to restrict function. He stood completely still while she worked and she could feel the tension in the muscles of his forearm, the held-in quality of a body, managing multiple simultaneous inputs. "What's happening out there?" she said. "We're containing them. They came in with 10. We've neutralized 6. He paused. "There are 4 more in the building. 2 appear to be moving toward the east secondary entrance, which means they know the layout." "They knew about the surgeon," Audrey said. "They knew about this room." "Yes." "Someone drew them a map." He looked at her. She could see him deciding how much to say. "I have a suspicion," he said. "You had a suspicion 4 hours ago." She kept her voice low, even, not accusing. "Have you moved it past suspicion?" He didn't answer that. The shooting from the east corridor stopped. The silence that followed it was the wrong kind. Not resolved, but suspended. The kind of silence that preceded something rather than followed it. Dorian pressed his earpiece. His face changed. "East secondary is compromised," he said. Callan was already moving toward the door when it happened. The secondary access panel, a utility door set into the back wall of the medical suite that Audrey had assumed was a supply closet and had never opened, blew inward, not exploded, forced physically, with something heavy applied to the other side with significant and deliberate force. 2 men came through it. Professional. Coordinated. The first one cleared the right side of the room before he'd fully entered it, and the second covered the left. They moved the way people moved when they had done this specific type of entry in this specific type of room many times before. The first man's weapon swung toward Callan. The second man's weapon swung toward the surgical table, toward Everett. Audrey moved before she made the decision to move. Her body did it. The same instinct that had made her step into the bay when Fenwick froze. The same wiring that had cost her the job she'd spent 9 years building. She was between the second man and Everett's table when her conscious mind caught up with her feet, and she was raising the gun, and he was raising his, and Callan was already moving toward the first man, and the room was suddenly very small and very loud. She fired. 1 shot. She aimed the way she had that day at the range, at the largest available target below center mass, because she was not trying to kill him. She was trying to stop him. The bullet caught him in the thigh and dropped him sideways, and his shot went into the ceiling, and the gun fell from his hand, and he hit the floor and stayed there. The sound of it filled every available space in the room. Audrey's arm dropped. Her ears were ringing. The smell of it was sharp and chemical and real in a way that she had not been prepared for, and her hand was shaking. Not badly, not in a way that had affected the shot, but it was shaking now. The first man was on the floor. She didn't look at why. She looked at Everett. Everett was awake, both eyes open, breathing fast and shallow. "Don't move," she said. Her voice was steady. She didn't understand how it was steady. "Your leg. Don't move." She was at the table in 2 steps, both hands on him, checking the shunt placement, checking the monitor readings, checking his pulse. The shunt was in place. The clamps had not shifted. His blood pressure had spiked hard, but it was already starting to fall. He looked at her face. "Did you just shoot someone?" he said. "I did." "Is he—" "He's alive. I hit his leg." She pressed 2 fingers to the inside of his wrist. "You're all right. The tube is fine." Everett exhaled a long, ragged breath and closed his eyes. Callan was crouching over the man on the floor. The first one. The one he'd dealt with. She didn't look. She heard a brief, quiet, violent conversation happening at a register that carried enough weight that she understood its general nature without needing the words. Then Callan stood and crossed to the man she'd shot. She heard him say, "Who sent you?" The man on the floor said nothing. Callan crouched. She still didn't look. She heard the man make a sound. Not a scream, just a sharp intake. The kind produced by pain applied to a specific location with precise intent. "Who sent you?" Callan said again. Same tone, same pace. The patience of someone who already knows the answer and is giving the other person the opportunity to confirm it. Silence. Then, a name. She heard it clearly. 2 syllables. A last name. She looked up. Callan's face had gone completely still. He stood slowly. His back was to her. She watched the line of his shoulders, the specific quality of stillness that had overtaken his body. Not the controlled stillness from earlier, not the compression of emotion under professional function. This was different. This was the stillness of someone who has received information that has rearranged something fundamental. Callan. Her voice was quiet. He turned. His face confirmed what she already suspected from the sound of it. The name the man on the floor had given was not a stranger's name. The way Callan's face looked right now, the particular flatness of it, the way something had gone out behind his eyes, that was the face of a man who had just heard confirmed what some part of him had already known. "Who is it?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Mitchell Graves," he said. She breathed in through her nose. She'd seen it. In that half-second before Mitchell had composed his face looking at Everett on the table. The absence of something, the presence of something else. She had filed it and said nothing because she couldn't be sure, because she was exhausted and operating in a context she didn't understand, because an accusation leveled incorrectly in that environment could have consequences she couldn't predict. "How long has he been with you?" she said. 14 years? He said it like the number weighed something physical. He arranged the shooter. Yes. He removed Dr. Pike from the facility. Yes. He told these men where to find you after you moved. Yes? She watched his face. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Mitchell has been managing relationships with several external organizations for the last 3 years. His position gave him access to information, logistics, personnel routes. What he apparently decided is that if Everett died and the resulting conflict weakened me sufficiently, he stopped. He's been positioning himself, planning a transition of authority. He was going to use your grief to destabilize you. Callan said nothing. He didn't need to. Audrey looked at the man on the floor. Her shot, the thigh wound, the controlled damage she'd done to stop him from shooting Everett Harrow. She looked at her own hands. The shaking had stopped, but the memory of it was still there. The physical record of what she had done tonight. "Where's Mitchell now?" she said. "He was in the North Corridor 40 minutes ago managing the perimeter communication." He paused, or appearing to manage it. "He was feeding information to the men coming in, while standing among my people." His voice had gone very quiet. The quieter Callan's voice got, she had learned tonight, the more dangerous the thing it was containing. "You need to know for certain before you do anything," she said. He looked at her. "I know for certain," he said. "You have a man on the floor who is in pain and has every reason to say what you want to hear. It's not just him." He reached into his jacket and retrieved his phone. He turned the screen toward her. A message thread, several exchanges, text she couldn't read fully from the distance. "While you were doing what you were doing in here, my people were doing what they do." The building's network access log shows an authenticated external transmission at 11:43 p.m. from Mitchell's credentials. He sent the facility's location to an outside number 40 minutes after we arrived. Audrey looked at the screen. She looked at Callan's face. He already knew. He'd known before the man on the floor said the name. He'd been carrying it since the access log came back, managing it the way he managed everything. Compressing it, functioning through it, waiting for the moment when it could be addressed. "What are you going to do?" she said. She watched him construct the answer in real time, watched him move towards something, the specific something that men with his history and his architecture defaulted to, the response that required no deliberation because it was already there, already built into the structure of how he operated. She said, "Don't." He stopped. "If you go out there and do what I can see you building toward," she said, "you're going to be starting something larger than what Mitchell already started for you." She held his gaze. 14 years. He knows everything. If his death looks like what it is, the people he was working with will have a reason to escalate. They need to understand what it costs to come at my family. They already know what it costs. You just neutralize 10 of their people. She took one step toward him. If you kill Mitchell the way you want to, you have a war. If you have a war, Everett doesn't go to rehabilitation. Everett becomes a permanent target. She paused. Is that what you want? The silence was very long. "No," he said. It came out rough. "Then you need another option." He stared at her. She could see him fighting the thing that was easiest and most natural and had served him for the entirety of his adult life against the argument she was making, which was not comfortable and required a patience he was not sure he had tonight. She was not finished. "Mitchell has been managing financial relationships for 3 years," she said, "which means there are records, transactions, communications, movement of funds. He would not have been able to build a parallel operation for that long without a financial infrastructure." She paused. "Federal investigators would find that infrastructure very interesting." Callan looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the assessment he'd given her in the street, not the controlled deference in the surgical suite. Something more complicated. The look of a man confronting an approach that had never been presented to him in this context, by this type of person, at this type of moment. "You're telling me to use law enforcement," he said. "I'm telling you to make him someone else's problem. Someone with the resources to dismantle whatever he built, and to do it in a way that takes apart the organization he was working with at the same time." She looked at Everett. "And I'm telling you that's the version of this where your brother gets to have a future that isn't lived from inside a bulletproof car." Callan was silent for a very long time. From somewhere above them, in the building's upper structure, she heard voices. His men, she thought, by the cadence and the discipline of it. The sounds of the breach being cleaned up, positions being resecured, the mechanics of the aftermath. "Mitchell is still in the building," he said. "Then find him before he realizes you know." Callan looked at her one more time with that specific expression she didn't have a name for yet. Then he moved to the door, stopped. "You fired that weapon," he said. "You shot a man in the leg when you could have— I know what I could have done." "Why didn't you?" She looked at Everett, whose eyes were closed again, whose pulse was moving steadily under the pressure of the clamps and the tubing and 9 years of her professional instincts. "Because I'm still a nurse," she said. "And I'm not going to stop being that because of where I am or what's happening around me." He held her gaze for 2 more seconds. Then he walked out. The door closed. The room was quiet for the first time in 20 minutes. Dorian was still in his position. The 2 men on the floor had been moved by Callan's people. She wasn't sure when. She'd been focused on the table, and the secondary utility door had been propped closed with a supply cabinet pushed against it. Audrey pulled the stool back to Everett's side. She sat down. She put 2 fingers on his wrist. His pulse was 58 beats per minute, steady, the cardiovascular rhythm of a body that had been through something catastrophic and was slowly, provisionally, deciding to continue. She looked at the clock on the wall. 41 minutes until Dr. Tran's estimated arrival. She looked at the shunt, still holding. She looked at the gun she'd set on the cabinet beside her. She picked it up, looked at it for a long moment, the weight of it, the reality of what it had done tonight and why, and what it meant that she had fired it and could not feel, in any unambiguous way, that she was wrong to have done so. She set it back down. She did not move it closer to her hand. She did not move it further away. Then Dorian's earpiece crackled and his face changed, and he said 3 words in a voice that had lost all its careful composure. "He's not there." Audrey looked up. "Mitchell," Dorian said. "He's gone. He left the building while the breach was happening." He pressed the earpiece again, listening, and the next sentence came out with the specific quality of information that changes the shape of everything that follows. "He took the access logs with him, and he made a call before he left." He looked at her. "Someone is coming, not the team we just stopped. Someone else. Callan's being told right now that 2 federal vehicles were spotted 4 blocks north 12 minutes ago." Audrey stood up. The federal investigators she had suggested as an abstract strategy 30 minutes ago had apparently already been in motion, and the question of who had called them, Mitchell, covering his exit with a story that cast him as the informant rather than the architect, was forming in her mind with a clarity she didn't want. Because if Mitchell had called federal investigators and framed the narrative before anyone else could, then what was about to arrive was not help. It was the final piece of the trap. And Callan Harrow, the man she had just convinced to step back from the solution that was brutal but legible, was walking toward it without knowing the ground had shifted beneath him. Audrey moved before she finished processing the information. That was the thing about 9 years in a trauma bay. Her body had learned to act on incomplete data, to begin the response while the mind was still assembling the picture. She was at the supply cabinet before Dorian finished his sentence, pulling open drawers with both hands, looking for anything that could serve as portable documentation. "I need paper," she said. "Anything. A notepad, packaging insert, anything with a blank surface." Dorian stared at her. "Now, Dorian." He moved, found a medical supply log on the cabinet shelf, spiral-bound, half the pages used, the back half blank. He handed it to her. She took it, and the pen clipped to its cover and stood at Everett's table, writing in the fast, compressed shorthand of clinical documentation. Shunt placement, clamp positions, arterial damage assessment, fluid volumes administered, timeline from initial injury to current status. She wrote it all down in 2.5 minutes, tore the pages free, folded them, and put them in her scrub pocket. If federal agents were about to walk into this building, there needed to be a medical record, something that existed outside of anyone's verbal account, something that said, in clinical language, exactly what had happened to Everett Harrow and exactly what had been done to keep him alive, because records were harder to disappear than people. "Get Callan," she told Dorian. "Right now. Tell him I need 60 seconds before anyone does anything else." Dorian hesitated. She could see him running the calculation, his instructions, his authority structure, the specific situation of a nurse in scrubs, giving him operational directives in a facility that was actively being closed in on by federal surveillance. "Please," she said. The word cost her something. She didn't use it carelessly. He went. She turned back to Everett. His eyes were open again. He'd been drifting in and out for the last hour, consciousness moving like tide, receding and returning, each time slightly stronger than the last, which was the right direction. The blood volume replacement was doing its job. The shunt was holding. His color was almost human now. "You're going to have company soon," she said. "Federal agents, possibly. If anyone comes into this room who isn't your brother or a doctor, I need you to say nothing, not one word. You understand me?" Everett's eyes were clearer than she expected. "Is Callan in trouble?" "Callan can handle Callan. I need you to focus on staying still." She adjusted the pulse aux clip. "Your one job tonight is to not move that leg, because it keeps being true." The corner of his mouth moved. "You're kind of terrifying." "I've been told." She straightened. "Mostly by hospital administrators, which is a different context, but the principle holds." Callan came through the door 40 seconds later with 2 of his men and an expression that told her he'd already received more information than Dorian had relayed. He looked at her, and she could see him integrating her presence into whatever calculation he was already running. "Talk," he said. "Mitchell called federal investigators before he left. He called them, which means he controlled the narrative. Whatever story arrived with those vehicles, whatever they were told was happening in this building tonight, it came from him." She held his gaze. "If you're standing in this facility when they come in, you are the story. Everything Mitchell needs to be true becomes true by proximity." Callan's jaw was tight. "I'm aware." "Then you need to not be here." He looked at Everett. "I'm not leaving him." "You leaving is the only thing that keeps him safe right now." She stepped toward him. "If you're arrested in this building, the leverage Mitchell built disappears. The financial records your people are looking for, the infrastructure he built over 3 years. Who finds it? Your people looking for it intentionally, or federal investigators looking for whatever Mitchell pointed them toward?" She watched him work through it. He was fast. She'd noticed that early. He didn't think slowly. He thought in parallel, running multiple lines simultaneously, and his face showed the convergence when the lines landed on the same conclusion. "The records," he said. "Your people need time to find them before anyone else does, and you need to not be the headline that buries the actual story." She reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out the folded pages. "I wrote a clinical account of everything I did for Everett tonight. Timeline, procedures, materials. If anyone asks what happened in this room, the document exists. It tells a medical story, not a criminal one." Callan looked at the pages in her hand. Then he looked at her face with the expression she'd been trying to name all night and still hadn't found a word for. "You're protecting him," he said. "I'm protecting my patient." She held the pages out. "Take these. Keep them separate from anything else you're carrying. If the worst case happens, and this goes somewhere I can't predict, that document is the cleanest account of what Everett Harrow's medical situation was when Dr. Tran arrives." She paused. It also makes it very difficult for anyone to argue that what I did tonight was anything other than emergency medical care. He took the pages, folded them once more, put them inside his jacket against his chest. Tran is 12 minutes out, he said. Then you have 11 minutes to be somewhere that isn't here. He moved to the table, stood over Everett with the same look she'd caught when he forgot she was watching, the one that wasn't controlled, that was just what it was underneath everything he'd built over himself. He put his hand on his brother's shoulder. I'm going to handle this, he said. Everett looked up at him. I know. Don't move your leg. That's what she keeps saying. Callan looked at Audrey one more time. The thing in his expression had resolved itself into something cleaner. Not simpler, but cleaner. The complexity was still there, but it had organized itself around a specific point. Whatever happens with the investigators, he said, tell them the truth. She blinked. Of everything she'd expected him to say in this moment, that was not it. Tell them exactly what you did and why, he said. Don't protect me. Don't shape it. A pause. You've spent tonight trying to save my brother. Don't spend tomorrow compromising your own account of it. She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure one was required. He left. His two men went with him. The secondary utility door, still blocked by the supply cabinet, remained blocked, and Dorian stayed at the main door, which was the only geometry that made sense. Audrey sat back down on the stool. 8 minutes, give or take. She spent them doing what she'd been doing all night, monitoring, checking, maintaining. Everett's vitals held, the shunt held. The clock on the wall moved through its increments with the indifference of machinery. At the 7-minute mark, she heard vehicles outside the building. Different from the earlier ones, these arrived without the aggressive convergence of the attack teams. Slower, more deliberate, with the particular cadence of official operations that didn't need to announce themselves through speed because they carried different kinds of authority. She heard voices in the upper structure, not gunfire, commands. The language of law enforcement entering a building, organized, procedural, loud enough to carry through walls. Dorian looked at her. She shook her head once. He stayed at the door. 3 minutes later, it opened. The man who came through was in his 40s, medium height, with a federal badge on a chain around his neck, and the careful, slightly over-alert expression of someone who had been told one story and was already finding the physical evidence inconsistent with it. He was followed by a second agent, younger, who cleared the room with his hand near his weapon before letting it drop. The first man looked at Everett on the table, at the surgical setup, at Audrey in her scrubs with her stethoscope around her neck and her hands resting in her lap with the deliberate stillness of someone who had decided not to appear threatening. Ma'am. His voice was professional, not hostile. Agent Carver, FBI. Can you tell me what's happening in this room? My name is Audrey Whitlock, she said. I'm a trauma nurse, previously employed at Mercy General Hospital. The man on this table is a patient with a gunshot wound to the femoral artery. I've placed a temporary vascular shunt to bridge the damaged section and restore circulation to his leg. A vascular surgeon is approximately 9 minutes from this location and will perform definitive repair upon arrival. Carver blinked. He hadn't expected that sentence. She could see him reorganizing. You performed this procedure. I did. Without a physician present. There was no physician available. The patient would have died. She said it the same way she'd said it to Richard Harmon across a desk that afternoon, which now felt like it had happened in a different life. I made the same choice I always make. He looked at Everett, who met his eyes with the careful blankness of someone who had been told to say nothing and was honoring that instruction with reasonable commitment. There are 2 men in the north corridor of this building, Carver said, both with gunshot wounds. I'm aware there was an armed confrontation in this facility tonight, Audrey said. I was in this room during it. I didn't leave this patient's side. One of those men... Carver stopped, recalibrated. He moved closer, dropped his voice. Miss Whitlock. We received a call approximately 40 minutes ago from an individual who identified himself as an employee of Callan Harrow. He described an active criminal operation and gave us this location. Is that right? She said. He indicated that Harrow was using this facility for criminal purposes and that there were individuals being held against their will. She looked at him steadily. Do I appear to be held against my will? A pause. No, he said. I'm sitting voluntarily beside my patient waiting for a surgeon to arrive. That's the full extent of what's happening in this room. She paused. Who made the call? Carver's expression shifted slightly. That information is part of an ongoing, the person who made that call, she said, orchestrated the shooting of the man on this table. He removed the surgeon who was supposed to be here before we arrived. He provided location information to an armed team that breached this building approximately an hour ago, and when that failed, he called you. Silence. I don't have evidence of any of that, Carver said carefully. Not yet. She folded her hands in her lap. The man who called you, his name is Mitchell Graves. He's been managing financial logistics for a criminal organization for 3 years, building his own parallel structure with funding he wasn't authorized to move. There's a financial record trail, transaction histories, external communications, movement of funds that don't reconcile with authorized operations. She looked at him. That's the investigation that's worth your time tonight. Carver looked at her for a long moment. She could see him doing what good investigators did, not accepting, not dismissing, but filing. Creating a space in his mental architecture where this information would sit until he could run it against what he knew. Where's Callan Harrow? He said. I don't know, she said. It was technically true. She didn't know his precise location. Was he in this building tonight? I was focused on my patient. Carver's mouth compressed slightly. He understood exactly what she was doing, and she wasn't trying to hide it, and somehow the transparency of it was more disarming than evasion would have been. The door opened. Dr. Lin Tran was 51 years old, Vietnamese-American, with short, silver-streaked hair and the manner of someone who had spent 30 years operating in high-stakes environments and had long since ceased to find urgency alarming. She came through the door with a surgical bag over her shoulder and a resident behind her and took in the room, the federal agents, the surgical setup, Audrey on the stool, in approximately 4 seconds. She looked at Audrey. Talk to me, she said. Audrey stood. 45-year-old male, gunshot wound to the left upper thigh, femoral artery involvement. Volume loss over an estimated 90 minutes prior to my intervention, tourniquet incorrectly placed by first responders for approximately 45 of those minutes. I placed a temporary shunt, 10 millimeter internal diameter flexible tubing, proximal clamp at the superior femoral junction, distal at mid-thigh. Shunt has been in place for... She checked the clock. 3 hours and 14 minutes. He received 2 units of packed red cells equivalent via the IV. You can see in his right arm. Last vitals were... She recited them. Every number, every timestamp, from memory, because she'd been building the record in her head all night. Tran listened without interrupting. When Audrey finished, the surgeon moved to the table and began her own rapid assessment, hands moving with the precise efficiency of someone who operated at this level as a matter of routine. Good placement, she said quietly, looking at the shunt. It might have been the highest professional compliment Audrey had ever received, delivered without ceremony in a voice calibrated purely for accuracy. Thank you, Audrey said. Carver was still in the room. Tran looked at him over her shoulder. I need this space sterile and I need it now. Anyone who isn't scrubbing in needs to be outside that door. Carver looked at his partner. He looked at Audrey. We're going to need a full statement, he said. I know. She moved toward the door. I'll be outside. She walked past him into the corridor. The corridor was controlled chaos in its post-crisis phase. Callan's men moving through it with the organized efficiency of cleanup, 2 of Carver's agents securing the men who'd been taken down in the breach, equipment and debris scattered across the floor. The overhead lights in the corridor were emergency level, casting everything in flat, unforgiving white. She stopped at the wall, put her back against it, let herself feel, for the first time in several hours, the full accumulated weight of the night. It came in through her feet first, up through her legs, arriving in her chest as a heaviness that was exhaustion and adrenaline metabolism and something more complicated that she didn't have a name for yet. Her hands were steady. She checked them deliberately, holding them in front of her and watching them, and they were steady. She didn't know why she needed to confirm that. She confirmed it anyway. Down the corridor, past 2 of Carver's agents, through a side door that was propped open. She could see a figure she recognized, the back of his head, the particular set of his shoulders. Callan was still in the building. He was in conversation with a 3rd agent she hadn't seen before, a woman in a dark jacket with a notepad, and the conversation appeared to be controlled and proceeding in a direction that was not, immediately, arrest. She watched for a moment. She had told him to leave and he hadn't left. She understood why. Everett was still in that room, and there was a version of Callan Harrow that was simply not capable of being in a different building from his brother until his brother was out of surgery. She understood it, and she didn't try to recalculate it. She found a section of clear wall 6 feet from the surgical suite door and sat down on the floor, back against the concrete, knees up. She had nothing left to do right now. The doctor was with Everett. The federal agents were doing what federal agents did. The specific emergency that had consumed every available resource she had for the past 4 hours was, for this moment, not requiring her hands. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. But she stopped performing alertness for approximately 90 seconds, which was as close as she was going to get. When she opened her eyes, Callan was standing in the corridor outside the agent's line of sight, watching her with an expression she was starting to recognize. The one that appeared when she did something he hadn't anticipated and he was processing the fact of it. She looked back at him. "She's with him," Audrey said, meaning Tran. He nodded once. "The agent's name is Carver," she said. "He received a call from Mitchell. The story Mitchell gave them was designed to make you the target and himself the informant." She paused. "I gave Carver Mitchell's name and the outline of what he built. I didn't have evidence. I gave him the shape of it." Callan moved closer and crouched so they were at eye level, his back to the corridor. "My people found the first layer of the financial architecture," he said quietly. "Transaction records going back 22 months. External accounts that don't connect to anything authorized." He paused. "There's enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough that if it reaches the right hands, Mitchell's version of tonight becomes very difficult to sustain." She looked at him. "Your people can't walk into a federal investigation and hand over documents." "No." He held her gaze. "But there are ways to route information that don't require a direct handshake. You'd be handing over evidence of your own organization's finances." "I'd be handing over Mitchell's finances. The two are connected but separable if the documentation is selective and the routing is careful." He paused. "It's not without risk." "What specifically are you risking?" "That the investigators take the gift and then come back for the rest of it." He said it flatly, without self-pity, just the accounting of it. "That I solve Mitchell's problem and create a different version of the same problem." "But Everett is safe." A long pause. "Everett is safe," he said. She watched his face. He had made the calculation before he sat down to explain it to her. She could see that. The explanation wasn't him working through it. It was him offering it to someone whose assessment he had, somewhere in the last 4 hours, begun to trust. She didn't know exactly when that had happened. She wasn't sure it mattered. "Do it," she said. He looked at her. "Root the documents," she said, "before Carver's team gets any further into this building's records and finds something Mitchell can turn around." She paused. "If there's a window, it's right now." He held her gaze for 2 more seconds. Then he straightened, reached into his jacket, and removed his phone. He made a call. 4 words, a location, a specific file designation she didn't recognize, and a name she didn't catch. Then he ended it. "It's done," he said. "How long?" 90 minutes before it surfaces in a format they can use." She nodded. Down the corridor, through the surgical suite door, she heard the controlled activity of people working at the edge of what medicine could do. The sound of instruments, low urgent voices, the specific focused energy of a surgical team that knew what it was doing. Everett was in the right hands. She had kept him in the world long enough to get him there. She looked at her own hands again. Still steady. Still the hands she'd trained for 9 years, the hands that had done what no one had explicitly asked them to do, because doing nothing was not a category she operated in. Carver appeared at the end of the corridor. He looked at Callan. He looked at Audrey sitting on the floor. He made the decision to approach, and she could see in his walk that the decision had been preceded by a conversation, something he'd received, or seen, or been told in the last few minutes that had shifted the angle of his approach. He stopped in front of them. "Ms. Whitlock," he said, "I need to ask you to come with me." She started to stand. Callan straightened beside her. "Not him," Carver said. "Not aggressive, specific. Just you." She looked at Callan. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything that could be heard. She stood the rest of the way up, straightened her scrubs, and looked at Carver. "Lead the way," she said. Carver took her to a room 3 doors down, a utility storage space that someone had cleared enough to place 2 folding chairs in, the kind of improvised interview space that field operations produced when there wasn't anything better available. He sat across from her with a notepad and his phone on record, and the careful professional neutrality of an investigator who had decided that what he was about to hear required his most precise attention. He said, "Tell me everything that happened tonight, starting from when you left Mercy General Hospital." She folded her hands in her lap, and she told him the truth. All of it. The rain, the SUVs, the blood on the window, the tourniquet, the surgical suite, the shunt, the breech, the weapon she'd fired, and why. The man she'd shot in the leg and not elsewhere because she was a nurse, and she did not stop being a nurse because the context became violent. She told him about Mitchell Graves's face when he looked at Everett on the table, the absence that she'd filed and not spoken and had been right about. She told him about the call that had been made and what she believed it was designed to accomplish. She did not tell him about the documents Callan had routed. She did not tell him where Callan had been when the breach happened. She told the truth about every single thing she had done and witnessed and decided, and she told it with the same flat, accurate, unapologetic voice she'd used in every trauma report she'd ever filed. Carver listened. He asked follow-up questions. Good ones. Specific, logical, the questions of someone building a timeline rather than a narrative. She answered all of them. When she was done, he sat back and looked at her for a moment. "You fired 1 shot," he said. "Yes." "Deliberate non-lethal targeting." "Yes." "The man is in the north corridor. He'll survive the wound." He paused. "You understand you may face questions about this." "I fired to prevent the shooting of my patient," she said. "I can explain that decision in any room you'd like to put me in." Carver tapped his pen against the notepad once. "Mitchell Graves," he said. "You gave me his name 20 minutes ago." "Yes. We have a flag on that name from an unrelated investigation. Financial Crimes Unit. They've been building something for approximately 8 months." He paused. "What you described tonight, if it holds, would connect to what they have." She said nothing. She waited. "The individual who called us tonight to report this location," Carver said carefully, "described himself as a whistleblower acting in the public interest." Another pause. "That claim becomes significantly harder to sustain if the Financial Crimes Unit can demonstrate he was the architect rather than the witness." Audrey looked at him. "Then I hope they can demonstrate it," she said. Carver held her gaze. Then he wrote something on his notepad. "I may need you again," he said. "I'll be available." She stood. "My patient is in surgery. I'd like to be nearby when he comes out." She left the room. The corridor was quieter now. Callan's men had pulled back to a perimeter that didn't conflict with the federal presence. The dynamic in the building had shifted from acute emergency into the procedural aftermath, which had its own specific gravity, slower, more documentary, the energy of people assembling accounts rather than making decisions. She found the wall outside the surgical suite again. She sat back down on the floor. She was still there 40 minutes later when the door opened and Dr. Tran came out, removing her outer gloves, and looked down at Audrey with an expression that was professionally composed but not unreadable. "He's out," Tran said. "The repair is complete. The arterial wall reconstruction held." A brief pause. "The shunt placement was—" She stopped, seemed to decide something. "You saved his leg. Possibly more." Audrey exhaled. It came out longer than she expected. "He's going to need significant rehabilitation," Tran continued. "Several months. But both legs are going to be functional." She paused. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Audrey said. It was approximately 70% true, which was better than it had been an hour ago. Tran looked at her for a moment with the assessing focus of a physician evaluating a patient without making it obvious. Then she nodded once, the nod of one medical professional to another, acknowledgement of the specific and unrepeatable thing that had been done tonight, and walked down the corridor toward Carver's position. Audrey sat on the floor with her back against the wall. Her stethoscope was still around her neck. The plastic bag with her personal items from Mercy General, the spare stethoscope, the granola bars, the photograph of her mother, the coffee mug, was somewhere in the rain outside, dropped when she'd reached for Everett in the SUV. She would need to go back for it, or not. She would figure that out later. Right now, she was sitting on a concrete floor in a facility that didn't officially exist, in scrubs she'd been wearing for 19 hours, having spent her first night after being fired performing emergency vascular surgery assistance in a criminal organization's medical bunker, firing a weapon for the first time in anger, giving a federal statement, and successfully keeping a man alive long enough for the people qualified to finish the job to arrive. She closed her eyes. Somewhere down the corridor, she heard Callan's voice. Not the words, just the sound of it, lower now, the compression from earlier finally beginning to decompress into something more human. She heard him ask something about Everett. She heard Tron's answer. She heard the long, unguarded breath that followed it. And then she heard footsteps moving toward him where she was sitting, and she didn't open her eyes, and she felt him sit down on the floor beside her. Not close, not far, the specific distance of two people who had spent a night in extreme proximity and were now recalibrating what normal distance was supposed to feel like. Neither of them spoke. Outside the building, somewhere above the industrial ceiling, Philadelphia was doing what Philadelphia did at 4 in the morning, moving, breathing, indifferent to everything that had happened beneath it. And somewhere in a car moving toward this location with federal records that would not reach Mitchell Graves in time to help him, the final piece of the night was still in motion, arriving at the speed of consequence rather than urgency, carrying the weight of everything that had been built and everything that was about to come down. Callan said quietly into the silence between them, "It's not over." Audrey opened her eyes. She looked at the corridor ahead of her, the light, the concrete, the specific reality of where she was and what the next hours would require. "I know," she said, and she was already thinking about what came next. The floor was hard, and the light in the corridor was the wrong color for 4 in the morning, and Audrey's back hurt in the specific way that came from spending hours bent over a surgical table that was the wrong height for her frame. She noticed all of this the way you notice things when the crisis has passed and the body begins submitting its bill. Callan was still beside her on the floor. He'd been there for 20 minutes without speaking, and she had not found the silence uncomfortable, which was information about the night they'd shared rather than anything else. People who had been through something together at that intensity developed a specific relationship to silence. It stopped being empty and became a kind of communication. Dorian appeared at the end of the corridor. He walked toward them with the particular gait of someone carrying information they're not sure how to present, and stopped a few feet away, looking at Callan with an expression that was carefully professional over something more urgent. "They found him," Dorian said. Callan looked up. "Mitchell." He didn't get far. He took the access logs from the server and drove north. One of ours spotted the car at a gas station on Route 1 about 40 minutes out. He paused. "Carver's team is coordinating. They want to move before he has time to—" "Where's Carver?" Callan said. "North end of the corridor. He's been on the phone since the flag came through." Callan stood. The movement was slower than earlier in the night. Not impaired, just the physicality of a body that had been running on emergency fuel and was now paying the metabolic cost. He looked down at Audrey. "Stay with Everett," he said. "That was already my plan." He held her gaze for a moment. "The federal situation. Whatever Carver asks you. You already told me to tell the truth." "I know I did." He paused. "I'm not retracting it. I'm just—" He stopped. Seemed to find the sentence an unexpected problem. "I'm aware that telling the truth tonight may create complications for you that aren't—" "Go deal with Mitchell," she said. He went. She got up off the floor. Her knees protested. She ignored them because knees were not relevant information right now, and walked back to the surgical suite door. She pushed it open. Everett was in recovery position on the surgical table, trans resident monitoring his vitals from a stool that looked exactly like the one Audrey had occupied for most of the night. The overhead light was still on. The surgical field had been cleaned and closed, and Everett's thigh was dressed in clean white gauze over a repair that had taken Tran's team an hour and 12 minutes to complete. There was color in his face. Real color. The gray had been replaced by something that was almost normal, and his breathing had the slow, deep quality of medicated post-operative rest rather than the shallow compensatory breathing of a body in crisis. He was alive. Not in the contingent, provisional, let's see if the shunt holds sense that had defined the last several hours. Alive in the ordinary sense, the permanent sense, the sense that would still be true tomorrow morning and next week, and for the foreseeable future, barring the introduction of new catastrophes. Audrey stood in the doorway for a moment and let that fact arrive completely. Then she walked to the stool beside the table, sat down, and put 2 fingers on Everett's wrist. 61 beats per minute, strong, regular. The resident looked at her. He was young, late 20s, with the slightly shell-shocked expression of someone who had performed surgery in an illegal underground facility in the middle of the night and was still integrating that experience into his understanding of what medical residency involved. "I've got it," she said. "Get some water." He looked uncertain. "I've been sitting with him all night," she said. "I'm not leaving. Go get water and come back." He went. She sat. She was still sitting there 20 minutes later when the resident returned, and still there an hour after that, when the sounds from the corridor outside shifted again. The departure of several vehicles, the reorganization of positions, the specific quality of change that indicated the situation above her was moving into a new phase. She monitored Everett through it. His vitals moved in the right directions. His color held. His foot, the left one, the one she'd watched turn pink in the SUV a lifetime ago, was warm when she checked it, which was the most beautiful clinical finding she had encountered in 9 years of practice. At 6:15 in the morning, Everett opened his eyes fully for the first time, not the half-consciousness of the previous hours. All the way open, with genuine focus behind them, the eyes of someone who had returned from a significant distance and was reassembling their understanding of where they were. He looked at the ceiling. Then he turned his head and looked at Audrey. "You're still here," he said. "I'm still here." He was quiet for a moment, processing the room, the monitoring equipment, the bandaged thigh, the IV in his arm. His face moved through several expressions in sequence: confusion, recognition, the specific recollection of what had happened arriving in fragments, and then something that was not quite relief but was in its neighborhood. "The surgeon came," he said. "Dr. Tran. She repaired the artery. The reconstruction held." "I have 2 legs." "You have 2 legs?" He exhaled. It was long and slow and contained in its exhalation things she didn't need to name. "Where's Callan?" he said, handling things. She adjusted the pulse ox. "He'll be here when he can." Everett looked at the ceiling again. "Is it over?" She considered the question honestly. "The most dangerous part? Yes. But not the rest of it. There's going to be a period of—" She stopped. He wasn't asking about his recovery. She revised. "Mitchell Graves has been located. Federal investigators are involved. The organization he was working with is being addressed through channels that don't require anyone in this room to do anything else tonight." Everett turned his head back to look at her again. His eyes were clear now, properly clear, the medicated edge receding as the hours put distance between him and the surgical anesthesia. "He told you about Mitchell," he said. "Eventually." "How long did it take him?" "Longer than it should have." Something moved through Everett's expression. Not surprise. The resigned, almost weary acknowledgement of someone who had lived their whole life in proximity to a man who found disclosure structurally difficult. "He trusts people very slowly," Everett said, "and he loses that trust once. That's it." He paused. "He trusted Mitchell for 14 years. "I know. Mitchell watched us grow up. He was at our father's funeral." He stopped, his jaw tightened. He sat in the front row. She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say about that, and she had learned that the impulse to fill silence with comfort often served the speaker more than the listener. "Is Callan all right?" Everett said. She thought about the way Callan had looked sitting on the floor beside her. The decompression, the specific sound of his exhale when Tran had told him the repair was complete. "He will be," she said. Everett looked at her for a long moment. "You're different from the people who usually come through that door," he said. "Which door?" "Any of them, the ones who orbit my brother's world." He paused. "People who come near Callan are usually there because of what he can do for them or what they can do for him. There's always a calculation." He paused again. "You got into the car because of the blood on the window." "Yes." "You didn't know who he was." "No." "And now you do." He held her gaze. "Does it change it?" She thought about that. The honest version of the answer. "It complicates it," she said. "Knowing who he is complicates what last night means. But it doesn't change what I did or why I did it." She looked at the bandaging on his thigh. "You were dying. That's the beginning and end of my part of this. Everett was quiet. Thank you, he said. Simple. Without architecture, the same way his brother had said it over the surgical table. She was beginning to understand that whatever else the Harrow family was, they had been raised by someone who insisted on certain kinds of directness. Don't thank me, she said. Go to your physical therapy appointments. The corner of his mouth moved. More than a ghost this time. An actual, complete expression. Yes, ma'am, he said. At 7:43 in the morning, Carver came through the door. He looked at Everett, awake, oriented, vitals stable, with the expression of a man updating his operational picture. Then he looked at Audrey. Can we talk? He said. She stepped outside with him. The corridor was almost empty now. A few of Carver's agents at the far end, trans-resident. The industrial ceiling above them catching the morning light that was beginning to leak in from somewhere she couldn't identify. Mitchell Graves was taken into custody at 6:41 this morning, Carver said. He was in possession of the access logs he removed from this facility. He paused. He was also in possession of a phone with several encrypted message threads that our technical team has been accessing since 7 o'clock. Audrey waited. The threads are extensive, Carver continued. They document approximately 20 months of coordinated activity, including financial transactions, personnel movement, and communications with the leadership of an organization we have been investigating under a separate warrant for 14 months. He looked at her steadily. The financial records we received through an anonymous routing this morning connect directly to those threads. She kept her face neutral. Mitchell Graves's position as informant is not going to be sustainable, Carver said. The evidence establishes him as the architect of what happened here tonight, not a witness to it. He paused. Our financial crimes unit is going to have a productive several months. She nodded once. I want to be clear about your status, he said. You are not under investigation. Your account of tonight is consistent with the physical evidence in every particular we've been able to verify. The individual you shot is being treated for a non-life-threatening wound and has thus far declined to give a statement, which is his right. He looked at her. The procedure you performed on Everett Harrow will require documentation through appropriate medical channels. That's a licensing board matter, not a criminal one, and given the circumstances, I would be surprised if it went anywhere. Is that a professional opinion or a personal one? She said. It's an observation about how these situations tend to resolve when the patient survives and the medical professional involved has a clean record and a clear account. He paused. You fired a weapon that isn't registered to you in a facility that doesn't have an official address, and your justification is that you prevented the murder of your patient, which the physical evidence supports. I've seen prosecutors pass on stronger cases than the one against you. She absorbed this. What happens to Callan Harrow? She said. Carver's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. That's a more complicated question. I know it is. He was quiet for a moment. Callan Harrow's organization has been a known entity for a long time. There are open investigations. There are also, at this particular moment, circumstances that have produced a body of evidence against a separate criminal organization that we have been trying to build for over a year. He chose his next words with evident care. Law enforcement operates with finite resources and makes strategic decisions about where to focus those resources. She looked at him. Mitchell's organization, she said. The one he was working with. The one he was working with, Carver confirmed, is significantly more violent and significantly less contained than the operation it was trying to destabilize. He paused. What happens to Callan Harrow is above my pay grade and outside the scope of what I can discuss with you. What I can tell you is that tonight's events are going to keep several investigative teams busy for a long time, and those teams are going to be focused where the evidence points. She understood what he was not saying. She had enough experience navigating institutional language, hospital administrators, licensing boards, the entire architecture of official speech that communicated by indicating the shape of what it wasn't saying, to read the space around his words. Will I need to come in for further questioning? She said. We'll be in touch, he said. For now, you're free to go. She looked at the door to Everett's room. I'd like to stay until he's stable enough to be moved. Carver looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, turned, and walked back toward the north corridor. She went back inside. Everett was dozing again, not the gray, desperate unconsciousness of blood loss, but the ordinary post-operative doze of a body doing the unglamorous work of beginning to repair itself. She sat back down on her stool. The resident had fallen asleep in his chair in the corner, chin on his chest, and she did not wake him. She sat in the quiet room and listened to the monitors and thought about nothing in particular for the first time in over 12 hours. It was a strange sensation. Her mind kept reaching for the next emergency, the next clinical calculation, the next decision point, and finding only the steady, unremarkable rhythm of a patient sleeping through the beginning of his recovery. She let it happen. Outside, the city was waking up. She could feel it the way you felt things in buildings that were adjacent to the world rather than separate from it, the low accumulation of traffic and motion, and the general resumption of ordinary life. Callan came back at 8:50. He came through the door without announcement, the same way he did everything, and looked at his brother first. The look lasted several seconds. She watched his body register Everett's breathing, the color in his face, the ordinary post-operative stillness, and settle into something different from everything it had been carrying all night. He looked like a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had been allowed, finally, to set it down. He sat in the chair the resident had vacated. The resident had apparently slipped out at some point while she wasn't watching, and put his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor for a long moment. She said nothing. After a while, he said, "Mitchell is in custody. His phone gave us everything. Our team and Carver's team spent the last 2 hours going through the threads and the financial records simultaneously." He paused. The organization he was working with, their leadership has been operating under assumed identities for 3 years. The records Mitchell kept gave federal investigators enough to move on 4 of them before noon today. "He kept records," she said. "He kept meticulous records." Something moved through Callan's expression. Dry, dark. 14 years of managing logistics made him meticulous. He couldn't run a parallel operation without tracking it the same way he tracked everything else. It's the professional habit of a careful man, which is ironic. His carefulness destroyed him. Yes. A pause. He's going to make a deal. He has enough to offer that the federal prosecutors will want it, and Mitchell will calculate the odds and take the option that keeps him breathing. He looked up. He'll spend the rest of his life in whatever arrangement they negotiate. He won't be on the street again. And the people he was working with, the ones they don't arrest today, will spend the next year looking over their shoulders. The financial infrastructure is gone. The leadership is exposed. He paused. A criminal organization without money or command structure is not a criminal organization. It's a collection of angry, underfunded people who can't coordinate. He said it without satisfaction, just the flat accounting of outcomes. Audrey thought about the night she'd spent. The specific accumulation of decisions, each one building on the last, each one narrowing the options until the path forward was the only path available. She thought about the gun in her hand and the way she'd fired it, and the fact that the man she'd shot was alive and would remain so. She thought about Richard Harmon behind his desk with his hands folded, and the termination paperwork and the 11 minutes that had ended 9 years. "I need to ask you something," she said. Callan looked at her. "The man I saved today at the hospital, before all of this." She looked at Everett. "His name is Dale Kruger. He's in a recovery room somewhere in Mercy General with 2 functional lungs because I performed an emergency thoracic procedure that I was told violated my scope of practice." She paused. "I got fired for keeping him alive." Callan said nothing. He was listening in the complete way she'd noticed about him, not preparing a response, just receiving. "I need you to understand that that's what tonight was," she said. "For me. It wasn't about your world or your organization or anything that comes with it. It was the same decision I made this afternoon in a trauma bay." She held his gaze. "I see someone dying, and I do the thing that stops them from dying. That's not a choice I make. It's just the only option I can see." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you because I don't want there to be ambiguity about what I am or what tonight means." She looked at the window that wasn't there, the concrete wall where a window would have been. "I'm not part of your world. I know that too. And whatever you're thinking about what I am to you..." She stopped, tried again. "I need it to be clear that I make my own decisions, about where I work and who I help and how I spend my time. That's not negotiable, and it's not going to change regardless of what happened tonight." He didn't look away from her. "I'm not trying to negotiate it. People with your kind of power usually don't realize when they're doing it. They don't necessarily intend to remove other people's options. They just have so much gravity that the options start disappearing without anyone making a conscious decision. He absorbed that. She could see it landing, not defensively, but with the weight of genuine recognition. The expression of a man hearing something true about himself that he hadn't had articulated to him before, or perhaps had heard and dismissed from sources he respected less. "What would you do?" he said. "If you could do anything, without the firing, without tonight, what would the next version of your life look like?" She hadn't been asked that question in a long time. She had been so focused on the immediate, the next shift, the next patient, the next problem, that the larger shape of what she wanted had been deferred into a category she visited rarely. "Something independent," she said, "not a hospital system, not a place where an administrator can undo what I do because it creates liability." She looked at Everett. People who don't have access to care, people who fall through the gaps in the system and end up in emergency situations that could have been prevented with basic, consistent medicine. She paused. "I've patched a lot of people together in trauma bays who never should have gotten that bad, because nobody was watching them before they fell off the edge." Callan was looking at her with the expression she still didn't have a complete name for. "What would that require?" he said. "A space, equipment, funding that isn't attached to billing cycles and insurance reimbursements." She paused. "It's not a new idea. Community medicine has existed for a long time. It's just consistently underfunded." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "My family owns a building on Kensington Avenue. It's been vacant for 3 years. It was used as a distribution facility before that, which is a use I've been moving away from." He said the last sentence without emphasis, the way you said things that were part of a larger ongoing process rather than a specific event. "The structure is sound. The square footage is adequate. It would need medical-grade renovation." She looked at him. "I'm not offering you a transaction," he said. "I'm not saying I paid for your clinic because you saved my brother. I'm saying I have a resource that exists and is not being used, and you have a need that exists and is not being met." He held her gaze. "Whatever form that takes, however it's structured so that it's genuinely yours and not something that comes with obligations attached. I'll fund the renovation and the initial operating costs. After that, it runs on its own or on whatever grants you can secure." She was quiet. "You'd have no claim on it," he said. "No involvement in how it's run. No access to the patient list or any information that comes through the door." He paused. "If you want me to sign something that makes all of that legally explicit, I'll sign it." She looked at Everett sleeping on the table. She looked at the repaired thigh, the clean dressing, the slow rise and fall of his chest. She thought about Dale Kruger with his 2 functional lungs in a recovery room she'd never be allowed to enter again. She thought about every patient she'd seen arrive in a condition that was the result not of sudden catastrophic injury, but of years of ordinary neglect. The slow accumulation of untreated conditions that nobody had caught because catching them required access that nobody had made available. "I'll think about it," she said. Callan nodded once. He didn't push. She noticed that too. 3 weeks later, Audrey Whitlock sat in the waiting room of the Pennsylvania State Board of Nursing and explained to a panel of 4 people with varying degrees of attentiveness exactly what she had done on the night of Everett Harrow's injury and exactly why she had done it. She told them the same thing she'd told Carver, the truth, in the same flat, undecorated language. She brought documentation, the notes she'd written on the supply log, Dr. Tran's surgical report, which Tran had filed with appropriate language about the improvised intervention that had preserved the limb, and a written account from Everett himself, submitted through a lawyer, describing his medical status at the time of Audrey's intervention and his assessment of the outcome. The panel deliberated for 2 days. They issued a finding of exceptional circumstances. No disciplinary action. A notation in her record that the intervention had been consistent with the ethical obligations of a licensed practitioner facing an acute life-threatening situation without available physician support. It was not an apology. It was not a reversal of her firing. It was the professional establishment acknowledging, in the qualified, careful language institutions used when they wanted to acknowledge something without fully committing to it, that she had not been wrong. She accepted the finding without comment and left the building. Outside, she called her mother. She stood on the sidewalk in the October sun and talked to her mother for 40 minutes about the board hearing and her plans and the building on Kensington Avenue and the months of renovation work that had already begun under the supervision of a contractor she'd vetted herself. She talked about what the clinic was going to be. Not an urgent care franchise, not a satellite of a hospital system, but something genuinely independent, funded through a combination of the Harrow family's initial investment, 2 small grants she'd secured from community health foundations, and a partnership with a pharmacy school that would send supervised students through 2 afternoons a week. Her mother asked if she was happy. She thought about it honestly. "I will be," she said. "I'm not there yet, but I can see the shape of it." That seemed to satisfy her mother, who was a practical woman and understood the difference between the promise of a thing and the arrival of it. Mercy General Hospital terminated the attending physician who had frozen during the tension pneumothorax that Audrey had resolved at the cost of her job. The termination came 3 months after her own, the result of an internal review that had been initiated, she learned later, through sources she didn't fully trace, by a formal complaint filed by 2 senior nurses who had witnessed the incident and had been waiting for the right moment to speak. The administrators who had signed Audrey's termination paperwork were not fired, but they were reorganized into positions with less authority over clinical staff decisions, which was the institutional equivalent of being told clearly and quietly that something had gone wrong under their watch. She was offered her old position back. She said no thank you, politely, by email, with genuine absence of malice because she was tired of being angry at institutions that were going to be exactly what they were, regardless of how she felt about them. She was building something instead. The renovation took 4 months. She was present for most of it, not directing the construction, but moving through the building as it changed, cataloging the space, imagining the flow of patients through it, the placement of examination rooms and the supply storage and the small waiting area. She wanted to have enough chairs and enough light. She brought in a consultant from a community health organization in Baltimore to assess the setup. She hired a practice manager, a bilingual medical assistant, and a part-time physician who had retired from emergency medicine and wanted 12 hours a week of meaningful work. She made every decision herself. Nobody questioned any of them. In January, the clinic opened. It opened without ceremony because Audrey did not want ceremony. She wanted the first patient to be an ordinary person walking through an ordinary door to receive care, not a ribbon cutting attended by people who would photograph the event and leave. The first patient was a 63-year-old man named Gerald, who hadn't seen a doctor in 7 years because he didn't have insurance, and the nearest free clinic required a 2-hour bus journey he couldn't reliably make. He had hypertension that was entirely manageable with a medication that cost $12 a month. He had been managing it instead with effort and luck and the occasional terrifying headache. Audrey took his blood pressure, explained what she was seeing, gave him his first prescription and a follow-up appointment for 3 weeks out, and watched him leave. She stood in the empty examination room for a moment after he went. There were 6 more patients waiting outside. She went to get the next one. Everett Harrow came to the clinic in February. He walked in on both legs, with a slight gait alteration that his physical therapist had told him would resolve over the next several months, and that Audrey assessed with the practiced eye of someone who had watched the color return to that specific foot on a specific night in a specific vehicle moving through the rain. He was more than she'd expected, fully recovered. He was, she realized, someone she would have found interesting and slightly exhausting under any circumstances, quick, direct, with a sense of humor that came at unexpected angles, and a genuine warmth that seemed entirely at odds with the world that had produced him. He brought her a coffee and sat across from her in the small administrative office behind the waiting room. "How is it?" he said, meaning the clinic. "Busy." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Underfunded in the ways I expected. Better than I hoped in the ways that matter. Callan's asking about the pharmacy partnership. He has a contact at... Tell him I have it handled." Everett looked at her. "He's not going to stop being interested." "I know, he can be interested. He just can't be involved." She held Everett's gaze. "The moment this place is connected to anything he's running, it stops being what I built it to be. He understands that. Then why are you here talking to me about the pharmacy partnership?" A pause. "Because he asked me to come see how you were, and he couldn't exactly walk in here himself, and asking about the pharmacy partnership was the reason he gave me for coming." She looked at him. He looked back with the expression of a younger brother who had spent his entire life navigating the gap between what his older brother was willing to say and what he actually meant. "How is he?" she said. "Different." Everett considered the word. Not completely. He's still Callan, but there are things he's doing now that, a year ago, I wouldn't have expected. He paused. He's been moving money out of certain operations, closing some things. The transportation and property companies have been expanding. He paused again. It's slow. It's complicated. There are people who don't want it to happen, and he's navigating that every single day. He looked at his coffee cup. But he's navigating it. That's new. She absorbed this. He doesn't expect anything from me for that, she said. He shouldn't. He doesn't. Everett's voice was simple and certain. He's not doing it because of you. He's doing it because he looked at the night. Everett almost died and asked himself honestly what he'd built and whether it was worth what it cost. He paused. You asked him a question that night, whether my future was worth protecting. I think he's still answering it. She looked out the small office window at the waiting room, where 4 patients were now seated in the chairs she'd chosen for adequate back support and reasonable comfort. An older woman with her coat still on, a young man with a bandaged hand, a mother with a child on her lap, who was making a drawing on the back of a brochure. Ordinary people in ordinary chairs waiting for ordinary care. Tell him the clinic is doing well, she said. Tell him thank you for the building. She paused. Tell him I said he should do what he's doing for his own reasons, and not because he thinks he owes me something. He knows he owes you something, Everett said. He doesn't. I made a choice in a rainstorm, and everything that came after was the consequence of that choice. Nobody owes me for consequences. She looked back at Everett, including you. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Is there a version of this where we're friends? You and me and Callan, where it doesn't have to be transactional. She thought about that honestly. I don't know yet. Honest answer. Only kind I have. He stood, picked up his coffee. He's going to ask me what you said. Tell him the truth. Which part? All of it, she said. He can handle the truth. I've tested that. Everett smiled. A real one, without reservation. The smile of someone who was alive and knew specifically that they were alive because of the particular accumulated decisions of a particular night, and had decided to feel that without complication. He can, Everett agreed. He's better at it than he used to be. He left. She sat in the office for another minute, finishing her coffee, listening to the sounds of the waiting room through the door. Then she got up and went back to work. 6 months later, on a Tuesday evening in late September, Audrey was locking the clinic's front door after the last patient when she became aware of someone standing under the awning. No SUVs, no men in dark jackets forming perimeters, no engines. Just a man standing in the beginning of a rain that was lighter than the one that had started all of this, standing with his hands in the pockets of a plain gray jacket that had not been chosen to impress anyone. She finished locking the door. She turned. Callan looked the same and entirely different. The architecture was still there. It was too much a part of his structure to disappear, but the compression was lighter. The thing he'd been holding all night in the rain 8 months ago, the thing he'd been holding probably for years before that, appeared to have been partially put down. Not completely. You didn't put down 14 years of one life in 8 months, but partially, perceptibly. He looked at the clinic sign. She'd chosen something simple, the street name, the word clinic, clean block letters. He looked at it for a long moment. How was today? He said. 31 patients. Caught a diabetes diagnosis that might have gone another year undetected. Set 3 broken fingers. Referred 2 people to specialists I've been cultivating relationships with. She tucked her keys into her coat pocket. Productive. He nodded. There's a coffee place on Clearfield Street, he said. It's not far, and it's about to rain harder. She looked at the sky. He was correct. The cloud cover had that particular density that preceded a serious downpour. She looked at him. He was not a simple man, and he was not a safe one in any of the ways that word was conventionally applied. And the world he was still partially inside of did not become less complicated because he was working at its edges. She had no illusions about any of that. She had too much information about the specific texture of his world to afford illusions. She also knew that he had sat on a concrete floor beside her at 4 a.m. without speaking because nothing that needed to be said could be said yet, and that he had told her to tell the truth to a federal investigator when the truth was not unambiguously in his interest, and that he had handed her a building and asked for nothing from it. She knew that his brother had walked into her clinic on 2 legs in February and sat across from her and smiled without reservation. She knew what her hands had done in a moving vehicle in the rain and in an underground surgical suite, and what those same hands were doing now, every day, in a building on Kensington Avenue that had been a distribution facility for things she chose not to think about, and was now somewhere people could walk in and be helped. The rain began to increase. She stepped under the awning. "Clearfield Street," she said. 3 blocks north. She looked at him for a moment. He held her gaze without performing anything. Not confidence, not deference, not the controlled architecture. Just his face in the rain with whatever was actually there. She did not take his hand. She started walking. He fell into step beside her. Behind them, the clinic's sign was still visible through the increasing rain. Steady, lit, the letters plain and specific on the face of a building that had been remade into something it wasn't before. 3 blocks later, they went inside out of the rain. The coffee was ordinary. The table was small. The conversation moved slowly at first and then less slowly. The way conversations moved when two people had already been through the kind of night that skipped introductions and went straight to the irreducible core of what someone was. She told him about Gerald and his blood pressure and the $12 prescription. He told her about a logistics company he was rebuilding from the ground up, with people who didn't know its previous history. She told him about the pharmacy school students who came on Thursdays, and the one who had impressed her last week with a differential diagnosis that she'd had to stop herself from commenting on because it would have embarrassed him in front of the others. He told her about Everett, who had started taking community college courses in the evenings and had mentioned once that he was thinking about public health administration. She laughed at that. A real one. Public health administration. I know. The irony. Significant. The rain outside increased further and then gradually began to diminish. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and looked at the window and felt the specific weight of the last 8 months. Not heavy in the way that things weighed on you when they were wrong, but heavy in the way that things weighed on you when they were real. When they had cost something and produced something in return that couldn't be easily categorized or quickly dismissed. She looked at Callan across the small table. He was watching her in the way she had first noticed in the SUV. Not assessing, not calculating. Just looking, with the attention of someone who had decided that the person across from him warranted it and was not going to look away. She looked back. Outside, the rain settled into the ordinary rhythm of an autumn evening in Philadelphia. Steady and unspectacular. The kind of rain that didn't make demands. The kind that simply happened and moved through and left the streets clean afterward. Not every story ended clean. This one didn't either. There were federal investigations still running, and Callan's world still had edges she couldn't see and wouldn't be told about. And the licensing board notation in her record would be there for the rest of her career. And the man who had frozen in a trauma bay and nearly let Dale Kruger die was now working as a hospitalist somewhere in New Jersey without having been held accountable in any way that fully satisfied her. None of that resolved. But Audrey Harrow was alive and thinking about public health administration. Gerald was managing his blood pressure with a $12 prescription. 31 people had walked into a building on Kensington Avenue today and been helped by hands that had refused to be idle, refused to defer, refused to accept that doing nothing was ever the only available option. And Audrey Whitlock was sitting across from a man who had learned at significant cost that the people worth keeping in your life were the ones you had to leave free to leave. Outside the window, the rain moved through. She finished her coffee. She did not get up to leave.